In this series of shiurim, we're going to be placing the world under the microscope of Torah. Let me explain what I mean by that. There are many events that happen in the world, many different, cases. Some involving Jews, some involving Jewish relationship with non-Jews. Some just looking and saying, well, what about this case over here? Well, what would happen if this was within a Jewish perspective? And halacha frames the Jewish eyes and mind of how to see these events. For example, take the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. How would a Bezdin respond to that event? How would a Jewish society respond to that event? These are questions that are often not asked. A lot of times when we talk about shiurim, we talk about halacha, we sometimes take the realm of halacha where the halacha creates the whole case, like kosher food. Don't to eat something that's not kosher. This definition of not kosher is totally found within the halacha. The prohibition is totally found within the halacha. It's totally enclosed by halachic parameters. We create the event, we respond to the event, and that's why most people study halacha. We look at a lot of these types of halachas. Fact is, though, is that there are situations where the events occur in the world that we have to respond to. This might be cases such as the cases that are found in Baba Kama, the Gemara Baba Kama, which deals with civil law, basically dealing with torts. What happens if an ox gores a cow? Well, in halacha, what happens if a car hits another car? The fact is that oftentimes when we study those cases, we don't take it to the real situations. Even when you study Shorshe Nageh Sapara, the ox goring a cow, how often do you understand that those principles will apply to situations such as car accidents? Matters of what happens with right-of-ways, how we walk down the street. The point is that there is a whole area of halacha which we do learn, but sometimes we don't truly analyze it in a real sense of how it applies to our day-to-day life. And in that greater sense, there are a lot of things that happen in the world that need adjudication. So as I referred to the oil spill, who's responsible? Who has to pay for the damages? These are examples of how halacha responds or clarifies how we are supposed to look at the world. And this is an area of Torah study which is not often investigated to the fullness of the extent of how it should be in our day-to-day life. Now, some people do this. That's where you get issues of questions of vegetarianism or ecology. There are organizations that do it, but oftentimes these are done by individuals who have a set agenda. Not that it isn't necessarily wrong, but usually, let's say, for example, people who are trying to investigate the halachic perception of ecology may already have a certain feeling about ecology. Vegetarians who argue for that it's halachically, they won't say it's absolutely mandated, but mandated by halacha that people should be vegetarian, but they're trying to argue that there's an argument for the idea that vegetarianism is proper within Torah, maybe an ideal within Torah, but these people themselves may have already been vegetarians. They already have a predisposition to this. The fact is, though, this is something that has to be on the mind of all of us. We have to know how to apply Torah to our day-to-day lives. Not just to actions which we will define as mitzvot in terms of trying to bring out a religious endeavor or something of that nature, but down to our everyday life. Wearing seatbelts. Should we be doing that? Should we not doing that? How we drive. Considerations in terms of other aspects of saying thank you or whatever. The point is that we have to have that in our minds And we have to know how to respond to the day-to-day events in the world. We also have to know how to learn from the world. Something occurs in the world, how do we learn from it? So interesting. I think back to what happened with Katrina and with Hurricane Katrina, and how so many different religions tried to say that Katrina was because God was angry and there was a punishment for A, B, C, D. Even to the extent that Muslims were saying it was a punishment for Israel, for the United States being friends with Israel, and Israelis saying it was a punishment for the United States putting undue pressure upon Israel. The fact is that when events occur of that nature, there is a concept that we're supposed to learn from them. How are we supposed to learn from them? How do we learn lessons from the world? This is going to be what we're going to be talking about. How do we respond? How do we learn? How do we deal with the world? Now, I've already mentioned one of the interesting aspects of this that really highlights the distinction or the aspect of a concern that we have to always maintain when we consider questions of this nature. And I referred to this already by referring to the people involved in ecology or the people involved in vegetarianism may already have had an agenda. So the fact is that in so many ways, when we deal with certain types of halachas, the halachas the Rambam refers to as chukim, for example, or also refers to them as chukim, laws that we don't necessarily understand, we don't have an ethical perspective, a separate ethical perspective. Don't eat kosher. We can have a feeling, well, I don't know why we don't eat kosher. We can think about it, well, like as Rashi says in Parshas Chukas, he says the non-Jews will look at us and say, what are the crazy thing they're doing? I remember there was once a video that was up called about what is a Jew, a video from many years ago. And one of the things on it was they asked a bunch of people what they knew about Jews and so forth. They asked, it was here in Toronto where it was filmed, and one woman said, a young woman said, they're people, they have their own meat stores, don't they? Like, why are they going to meat stores for? Fact is that Rashi refers to that. The non-Jews will look at things like kashrus and say, this is crazy. Why do people care about that? Why do these people care about that? Yeah, we have that response to kashrus. But when you really think about kashrus, you're going in there to eat something that's kosher. Outside of halacha, the clear-cut statement of halacha, is there any ethical perception to it? The Rambam says you're not even supposed to have any ethical perception to it. You're supposed to look at pork and say, gee, I'm sure it tastes good. Kodesh Baruch Hu said, though, not to eat it. But the only thing we know about the ethics of halacha is from ethics of kashrus is from the halacha. But when it gets to other areas, such as ecology, vegetarianism, how we treat animals, extension of that idea, gets to questions of towards charity, other aspects, but it gets to a whole way that we get into the world, we start having our own ethical perspectives. And that yields a completely different that yields a need for a completely different understanding of what you have to work through in getting to the halacha, because your own natural ethical perspectives play a role. Sometimes you have to be concerned about that role, and sometimes you actually have to apply that role. Concepts such as Chilul Hashem, Lefnim Mishur Sedin. Look at the Rambam's concept, the Ramban's concept of Tova Yashar, Kedoshim Tiyu, which he says somehow we're supposed to learn from Torah, but also our own application of our own ethical perspectives. The fact is that in dealing with life issues, especially when the world itself is coming up with ethical ideas, we have to be careful in our analysis of halacha that we are sure of what the halacha says, not just projecting onto some sources what we think is correct. Let's look at the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Think about this. I'm sure a lot of people already have ethical responses to this event. BP was responsible. This person's responsible. That person, this company's that's responsible. These people are hurt. They have to be taken care of. We all have our own internal ethical responses to that. So the fact is, when I will look up the halacha of this issue, I have to be aware of my own bias. But in the same time that to be aware of my own bias, there's actually a place in many halachas for you to be concerned about to apply your own bias. Your own bias actually plays a role in the halachic determination. That's something that comes up, especially when we start looking at world events. So one of the things that's extremely significant and unique about this whole area of halachic analysis is working with our own individual moral perspectives and how to work with that in congruence with the halacha. Not to make you read into halacha a certain way, but also also to recognize when the halacha says, brings yourself into it a little bit. What do you feel? That might be a halachic characteristic or category in the decision making. The second thing you should be aware of in terms of this whole analysis of halacha is that there's a remarkable random element to everything to do with this area of halacha, because it usually, I should say not every area, but it seems to apply to most areas in this perspective, because it usually deals with laws ben adam l'chavero, laws between man and man. And you know what the unique thing about that is? Is the human being is a random figure. You have to know the human being you deal with. One person, you show him respect one way. Another person, you do the exact same thing, and they find it disrespectful because of culture, because of personality. You know, I remember when I was in graduate school, they pointed out the fact that in Japan, it was considered to be proper when you stood very close to a person. But in North America, that was considered to be too uncomfortable. So you stand a little further apart. So they told a case of a fact where some American was meeting a Japanese person for the first time, and he met them. They were talking. The Japanese person moved closer, and the American person moved back. The Japanese person moved closer. The American person moved back. Because the fact is, the Japanese person felt that it was proper and it was good manners to come closer. The American, feeling that it was being crowded, he needed to have his own space a little bit. He thought that this was something he was crowding the other person, and it became a certain dance that kept happening. And each person was getting upset. The American was saying, "Why is this guy crowding me?" And the Japanese person says, "Why is this guy moving away from me? That's disrespectful." Someone explained to him the fact it's culture. The point is that when you're dealing with mitzvahs such as those that are concerned with respect, the fact is you have to know the random factor of the person. You have to know this in terms of a lot of aspects. What is the person like? What does that person appreciate? You can't have totally objective definition of halacha. That statement is actually a statement of Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. He says one of the reasons that the mitzvahs ben adam l'chavero do not fill many siyufim, many different points in the Shulchan Aruch. Like you have pages and pages of details in terms of, let's say, a shechita. But in terms of Bikur Cholim, you're told the concept, go visit the sick. But you're not going through the details. Why? Because you have to know the person. Menachem Avil, you want to go and you want to comfort the mourner. You have to know the person. What's comforting to one person is not comforting to another person. And a lot of times people come in there with rote. They're looking for rote. This is one of the great weaknesses in halacha. People look for rote. They want black and white. What should I do? Black, white, this. And the fact is, when you're dealing with other human beings, you can't be so black and white. Because you have to see what they're about, what they're involved in, and what their personalities are like, what they consider to be proper and improper, and so forth. It's a balance, and that has to be taken into halachic consideration. Sometimes the halacha is very adamant. This is proper. Sometimes the halacha is a little bit more understand or subjective in terms of saying, hey, it depends upon the people. So that's the secondary importance. So you start putting the world under the microscope of halacha. First of all, you have to start knowing yourself. What are your values? What are you coming to the halacha with predispositions, with bias? And how are you supposed to use that bias in the understanding of the halacha? The second point is in terms of knowing individuals. and knowing knowing how to respond to individuals, and knowing what they're talking about, because the halacha sets not just strict standards of behavior, but set that there's a goal, and therefore to really accomplish that goal, you have to know the other. So you have to know yourself, and you have to know the other. There's another aspect to knowing yourself, your own ethical perspectives. It's very interesting how it also affects certain halachic perspectives of meta halacha. For example, there was once a situation I had to deal with where there was a situation where a person was going out with another person who they couldn't marry, halachic barriers to marriage. It was a Kohen going out with a woman where there were halachic issues in terms of marrying that woman. Okay? And the question was, is there a way we could work out a heter for them to get married and so forth? So there was myself and another rabbi who were asked those questions. Other rabbi had a connection with a gadol, a special connection with a person who was an adam gadol, a Baal Halacha, and they said, you know something, why don't you ask him? And his response to me is, he said he doesn't think anything about romance. He said this gadol has a certain view of a man-woman relationship. He'll just sit there and say, so they can't get married, so go get someone else. There will be no motivation for this gadol to try and work out to let them get married. This is in contradistinction to a story that Rav Hershel Schachter recounts about Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, where Rav Yoshe Ber was faced with a similar situation of a woman who seemed to be halachically usher to marry, prohibited to marry a Kohen, and what occurred was is that Yoshe Ber stayed up all night trying to work out a heter. Why? Because he valued this idea that there was a relationship here, there was a romance here. So he tried to work it out in terms of heter. See, there's so much ideas of how you look at the world and so forth. The fact is, in certain situations lead to another issue. When is it proper to be mater? When is it proper to find leniency? When is it improper to find leniency? When is it improper to be stringent? See, these laws exist in many, many facets of halacha, these different issues. But the fact is, they really come up when you are looking at the world, at events, where everyone in the world has to make a decision. Throughout the world, people are making moral decisions. And we as Jews obviously have to also make moral decisions in the same areas that these people make decisions. That the whole world is making decisions. The only thing is we of course have to apply halacha in making those decisions. And that is a very, very different process than most of us think of in terms of halacha. Yes, halacha deals with the same issue that everyone in the world deals with. But the fact is, it is unique to the halachic process. And in these series of shurim, that is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at issues that everyone in the world is already rendering ethical, moral decisions about. Pro, con. And we have to, in the same way, respond to that. And in our response to that, we have to consider what's going on in the world, based upon the famous maxim that's brought down. Say, Vasita Yashar V'Atov. We're supposed to do what is good and what is straight. Okay? Chazal say, Hayashar B'nei Adam V'Atov B'nei Shemayim. Okay, Hayashar, that's straight in the eyes of men, and what's good in the eyes of God. It's a balance. The fact is that there's certain things we have to take God, and we have to recognize that some ethical values that come from man actually also are legitimate. After all, we were given our own internal mechanism of understanding Tov and Ra through Adam and Chava. So something is a mechanism in ourselves, within ourselves, of this idea of Tov and Ra. There's an idea within ourselves of making moral and ethical decisions. So the halacha comes around and also has to recognize that. But this really comes out in areas where we have to have positions where the entire world also has positions. And a lot of times we don't think about that. the question about health care that happened in the United States, right? About health insurance. That was a halachic issue. A lot of people didn't see that. They missed that point. Issues of taxation, halachic issues. Should we have bailed out the bank? Should we have bailed out Chrysler and GM? These would be halachic issues within a halachic world. And the fact is that those are the kind of issues we have to look at. Of course, they also get into issues where we look at situations such as Israel as well. The flotilla. What happened like that? Why does the world see it that way? How do we see it? Sometimes it's so easy to just respond because they all hate us, without understanding what's really going on here in terms of their perception, our perception. Where's the real essence of odds here? Because they seem to be arguments from an ethical perspective. What's the fault in that ethical perspective? Or should we actually be more concerned about that ethical perspective? These are all issues that will come up. And this is what I hope to deal with in this series of shiurim, as we place the world under the microscope of Torah.